there. Professor Zeeb here. Hello, and welcome into our video lecture. This time we're going to talk about adolescence and the physical development of teenagers, okay? And, some of the things we're going to look at are some of the brain development that happens and puberty, which obviously is a huge key part of the development of adolescence physically. So let's kind of take a look at that. Okay, so let's take a look at physical development in adolescence. So it turns out that during adolescence, especially during the beginning of adolescence, we're going to go through some major growth spurts. And once again, as we said before in previous lectures, that girls typically would go through these earlier than boys. So we know that teenagers go through growth spurts, and sometimes this explains the voracious eating habits that teens have, where they're actually clearing out the refrigerator and pantry at times because they need fuel for their bodies as they're growing and so forth. All right, so let's take a look at this graph here. So here we have centimeters per year, inches per year, depending on what system you're using, and then of course our ages. And so this is the rate of height increase across the lifespan to adulthood. If you remember, we said that in infancy, growing incredibly fast, but then it starts to sort of stabilize. Notice this is broken up by girls and boys by the different lines. Then as we approach puberty and adolescence, we see these spikes here. Do you guys see that? So notice that girls are going through this a little bit earlier than boys. So roughly around age 12, they're going to peak out. For boys, it's a little bit later, possibly around 14, 15. So once again, this explains why, I think I gave this example before, but around 5th or 6th grade, you really see that a lot of the girls are taller than the boys on average. So girls go through those growth spurts earlier, but the point is that we do go through those during adolescence. So we would expect to grow. Obviously, one of the major highlights physically of adolescence is the development of the reproductive system, including puberty. So that's really what we're going to focus on in this short lecture here. So let's talk some puberty. We're going to give you, first of all, a very technical description of this given in our textbook. So puberty is a brain neuroendocrine process that provides stimulation for rapid physical changes that occur in early adolescence. Wow, a lot of jargon there, a lot of technicality. But it just sort of explains what happens and what causes puberty to happen. And as it turns out, it is regulated by hormones. Okay, so let's go to this next slide here. Our two key players in the brain are going to be the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So our hypothalamus, the structure here, which is responsible for things like regulating hunger, the fight or flight response, but also sex, reproduction. So at a certain time in our life, once again, as we approach adolescence, the hypothalamus will send a signal to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, of course, the master gland in the body, which causes this gland to secrete chemicals into our bloodstream, which go to the particular body parts. In this case, our focus is going to be the gonads, which of course are the testes and the ovaries, which trigger a lot of these changes that we see with puberty, okay? So once again, this is due to the regulation of hormones in our bloodstream and where these two structures are interacting in the brain. Let's look at some milestones here, okay? So we mentioned our growth spurts already. Menarche, which is the girl's first period. We see this variation here. Our average is about 12 and a half. You can see that breast development does happen before that, pubic hair. Now notice girls are ahead of boys once again. And then for boys, of course, genital growth, and then nocturnal emissions, which is our fancy name for a wet dream. So typically that happens around the mid-teens or so, if you would. By the way, so we said our menarche is the girl's first period, a spermarche, which typically is a wet dream for most boys, but depending on the scenario, is usually between 12 and 16, okay? So menarche is around 12 and a half. For boys, it ranges from 12 to about 16. Okay, so now we're going to look at the psychological impact of puberty. How does this affect us when we start to encounter these changes, which are confusing and pretty drastic in some cases? Okay, so we're going to look at the psychological impact in females, and we're going to find some differences between boys and girls here. Research has determined that puberty can be a frightening negative experience, especially if the female is unprepared. So in other words, if mom and dad never sat down with their daughter and had the talk, if you know what I mean, and all of a sudden they go through these changes, you can imagine how frightening that would be if they're not understanding, why there's blood or why am I feeling this way. You can understand how it could be frightening and negative. So very important for parents to prepare their child for these changes that are about to happen. It's very important to do that. A lot of times schools kind of do this, but ultimately it's the parent's job, in my opinion, to sit down on a personal level and discuss these things so the teen knows what to expect and it's not too much of a shock when it actually happens. Okay, so what happens if a girl goes through puberty prior to 11? We are finding that girls are going through it earlier and earlier, and we'll talk about that later. Remember, we said the average menarche is about 12 and a half. So what happens if it happened? What happens? What are the consequences, according to studies, if it occurs prior to age 11? Well, it turns out they're pretty negative. It's associated with depression. It's associated with substance abuse. So that female is more likely to abuse substances. Remember, this is correlational data once again. More likely to be a smoker. More likely to have an eating disorder. More likely to experience sex at an earlier age. Now, guys, obviously that's a concern because of STDs, STIs, sexually transmitted infections, but also teenage pregnancy, which obviously we don't want in most cases, right? So it is linked to many different issues there. So in other words, what we're saying is that these different findings here, let's go back to that, are more likely to happen if the girl experiences puberty before age 11. Now remember, we're not saying they necessarily will or it causes that to happen. We just see higher risk factors for all of these areas if a girl goes through puberty earlier than normal, in this case, prior to age 11. Okay, so let's look at how it's different for boys. We do see some differences here. So remember, sperm mark is our fancy name for the boy's first ejaculation, okay? If a boy goes through sperm mark early, remember we said the average is about 12 to 16, these early maturing factors may bring feelings of self-confidence and popularity. I thought that was really interesting. How we said with girls, if they're unprepared, it's linked with depression and substance abuse and et cetera, where when boys go through this earlier, it's almost like high five time with their buddies. They feel confident, they may brag about it. It makes them popular with their peers, as an example. So I really thought that was interesting how those differences are in play according to what the studies are basically showing. All right. So this will conclude our short lecture on the physical development and pubertal changes, boys and girls in adolescence. Please progress to the next step in the class.